Tenway Concord smelled like 100 different atmospheres pretending to be one. Fen coolant vapor drifting through the lower docks. Corvain spice oil from the market rings above it. The dry, mineral hum of Kell hive chambers tucked into the station's oldest section, where Yeth had grown up learning to read a room by the way its air moved rather than the way its voices sounded. 6 species called the Concord home in some fashion or another, and none of them agreed on much, except that the arbitration hall at its center was the one place on the station where an argument could be settled without anyone reaching for a weapon first. Nobody on Tenway Concord could tell you where the ledger auditors came from. That was the first thing Yeth Ora learned as an apprentice, and it bothered him more than anything in his training manuals. He had asked 3 different senior arbiters. He had asked the station registrar. He had even asked a ledger auditor directly, once, and gotten a small, patient smile and a change of subject. The auditors owned nothing. They filed no personal records. They took no fee beyond the standard arbitration stipend, which they mostly gave away. They arrived on transport manifests that always listed their species as unlisted, verified neutral, which was a category that existed nowhere in consortium law except, somehow, for them. Yeth was thinking about all of this on the morning the dockworkers' dispute nearly turned violent. It started over cargo weight. A Corvain shipping crew claimed their contracted tonnage had been shorted by a full third. The dockmaster, a heavy-set Fen with a temper Yeth had learned to avoid, insisted every crate had been logged and verified. Both sides had brought muscle. Both sides were shouting in overlapping frequencies that made Yeth's mandibles ache just standing near them. Then the auditor arrived. She was small for a ledger officer, unremarkable in the grey station uniform they all wore, her face the kind of face you forgot within a minute of looking away from it. Her name, according to the roster, was Mara Voss. She walked into the middle of the shouting without raising her voice at all, and somehow the shouting stopped anyway. "Show me the manifest," she said. "Both copies." The Corvain crew chief thrust a data slate at her, feathers still raised in agitation. The dockmaster did the same, grudgingly. Mara Voss read both in under a minute, standing perfectly still, her eyes moving in small, precise sweeps. "The tonnage wasn't shorted," she said. "It was split across 2 manifests by mistake. Container 419 was logged twice under different batch codes. You're arguing over cargo that both of you already have." There was a silence. Then the dockmaster checked his slate again, and swore quietly, and the Corvain crew chief's feathers slowly lowered. Yeth had seen senior arbiters spend a full shift on disputes smaller than this one. Mara Voss had needed less time than it took to walk across the docking bay. "How did you do that so fast?" he asked her afterward, falling into step beside her as she walked back toward the arbitration hall. "I read the numbers instead of the people," she said. Everyone else in that bay was listening to who sounded angrier. "That's it. That's the whole trick." "That's most of it," she said, and there was something almost like amusement in her voice. "The rest is not caring who's angrier." Yeth wanted to ask her more, but she was already moving on to the next case on her list, and asking a ledger auditor personal questions rarely got you anywhere. Still, he found himself watching her more carefully after that. The way she never touched the credit transfers that came through arbitration fees, sliding them instead into a station relief account without comment. The way she never mentioned a homeworld, a family line, a hatching cohort, any of the small anchors every other being on the station used to place themselves in the galaxy. Yeth had joined the arbitration apprenticeship 2 years earlier for reasons that felt, in hindsight, almost embarrassingly simple. He had grown up in a mining collective where disputes were settled by whoever shouted longest, and he had wanted, badly, to believe there was a better way. Kell apprentices were supposed to want consensus, the smooth agreement of a hive mind speaking with one voice. Yeth had never been very good at that. He wanted fairness instead, which his cohort mates found strange, and which was probably why he'd ended up shadowing the one arbiter on the station who seemed to want the exact same thing. The second case of that morning was smaller, but it stayed with him longer. A freight handler, young and clearly desperate, had tried to slip a folded credit sheet across the review desk along with his paperwork, the kind of quiet bribe every apprentice was warned about on their first day, and every arbiter pretended not to notice at least once in their career. Mara noticed it immediately. She didn't raise her voice, didn't call security, didn't even look particularly surprised. "Pick that back up," she said, sliding the sheet back across the desk without touching it. "Your case is straightforward enough that you don't need it, and if it were complicated enough to need it, this wouldn't be the way to win it." The freight handler's antennae had drooped in something like shame. "I heard the ledger takes bribes sometimes." Just, quietly. "Everyone does, out here." "Everyone does a lot of things out here," Mara said. "That's usually the problem, not the excuse." She reviewed his case anyway, found in his favor within minutes on the strength of his actual paperwork, and sent him off looking more confused than grateful, as if fairness without a price tag was a concept he'd have to sit with for a while. Yeth thought about that exchange for the rest of the day. Something in the way she'd handled it, no anger, no lecture, just a flat refusal that closed the door without slamming it. He didn't know it yet, but the question he'd been asking for weeks, "Where do the ledger auditors come from?" was about to get an answer that would change how he understood every species he'd ever met, including his own. It started, as these things often do, with a shipping contract that looked completely ordinary. Tenway Concord sat at the exact gravitational midpoint between three trade blocks, which was the entire reason for its existence. No single power controlled it. Its laws were older than any of the empires that used it, written in an era when the galaxy had needed, badly, someplace neutral to stand. The ledger ran its arbitration hall. Nobody remembered exactly when that arrangement had started, only that it worked, and that questioning it too loudly was considered bad manners bordering on bad luck. Every apprentice learned the same handful of facts about the ledger during orientation, recited so often they'd worn smooth like river stone. The ledger predated the Concord's current charter. The ledger took no side in any dispute involving station governance, trade law, or interspecies conflict. The ledger's internal structure, funding, and recruitment were matters sealed under a clause so old most residents assumed it was ceremonial rather than literal. Yeth had assumed the same thing himself, right up until the week everything he thought he understood about his own station came apart in his hands. Barrow Ken owned roughly a third of the Corvain shipping lanes running through the Concord, and he did not care for bad luck, questions, or arbiters who read numbers faster than he could hide them. He had built that third of the shipping lanes from almost nothing, a fact he mentioned often enough that Yeth had stopped counting the retellings. 3 decades of buying up failing routes, absorbing smaller competitors, and cultivating exactly the kind of quiet political goodwill that made station officials slow to ask hard questions. He was, by every visible measure, a model citizen of the Concord. He funded a wing of the medical center. He sponsored 2 apprenticeship programs unrelated to arbitration. He was, Yeth had heard more than one dock worker say, the kind of powerful that made itself comfortable to be around, which was its own quiet danger, if you thought about it long enough. Yeth first heard the name during a routine contract review Mara had asked him to sit in on, more as an observer than a participant. It was meant to be simple. A resupply contract between Barrow Ken's shipping consortium and a mining collective out past the drift, flagged for a minor discrepancy in delivery timing. Mara went through the manifests the way she always did, in careful, unhurried passes. Yeth watched her pause on the 3rd page longer than usual. "This delivery schedule doesn't match the fuel consumption logs," she said, mostly to herself. "Rounding error," said the Corvain representative sent to answer questions, a smooth-feathered junior executive named Dassit. "Happens constantly on long routes." "It happens on this route 17 times in the last standard year," Mara said. "Always in the same direction. always favoring the same set of accounts. Dassid's feathers went very still, the Corvain equivalent of a held breath. "I'll have someone look into it." "I'd appreciate that," Mara said, in a tone that made it sound like she already knew nobody would. "With respect," Dassid tried again, "Barrow Ken's consortium has held a clean arbitration record for 11 years. Perhaps the discrepancy is a fault in the fuel logs themselves, not the shipping records." "That's possible," Mara said. "It's also easy to check. I'll pull the fuel depot's independent logs and compare them against your consortium's reported figures. If the depot's numbers match yours, I'll close this without another word about it." Dassid didn't answer that, which told Yeth almost as much as an answer would have. She flagged the contract for a full audit, filed the request through standard channels, and moved on to the next case, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Yeth, walking beside her afterward, felt a small crack of unease he couldn't quite name. "That representative looked scared," he said. "He should be. Someone's been skimming fuel allowances and routing the difference through shell accounts for over a year. That's not a rounding error. That's theft, and it's probably not his." "Whose, then?" Mara was quiet for a moment. "Someone higher up the chain. Someone who thought nobody would ever read the fuel logs closely enough to notice." Yeth thought about Barrow Ken, whose name he'd started hearing in nervous whispers around the docking bays lately, always followed by a quick change of subject. He didn't say the name out loud. He didn't need to. Mara's expression told him she was already thinking it. That night, back in the small shared quarters the apprentices used, Yeth pulled up the station's old archive files out of habit more than purpose, the way he sometimes did when he couldn't sleep. He was looking for precedent cases involving contract fraud, something to help him understand what he'd watched that afternoon. Instead he found a fragment. It was buried in an old maintenance log from decades before his hatching, mislabeled and half-corrupted, the kind of file nobody bothered clearing out because nobody ever looked at it. Most of it was unreadable. But one phrase survived intact, repeated twice in the margin notes of a long-dead station administrator. Species 0. Reference, the long quiet. Yeth stared at it for a long time. He had never heard either term before, not in any history course, not in any archive he'd accessed in 3 years of apprenticeship. He tried searching both phrases separately. Both searches came back empty, scrubbed clean from every public record on the Concord. Somewhere, a very long time ago, something important had happened, and somebody had gone to a great deal of trouble to make sure nobody remembered what. He didn't mention it to Mara the next morning. He told himself it was because it probably wasn't important, an old clerical error, a coincidence. But some small part of him suspected that if he asked her about it directly, she would give him the same patient smile and change the subject, and he wasn't ready to find out he was right. The full audit into Barrow Ken's shipping accounts took 9 days, and by the 6th, Yeth had stopped believing it was a rounding error. He'd been assigned to help compile the raw data, cross-referencing manifests against fuel logs against payment records. A task tedious enough that his supervisors clearly hadn't expected him to notice the pattern underneath it. But patterns were the one thing Kell apprentices were trained from hatching to notice. It was how consensus worked, how a Kell mind found agreement inside a swarm of small signals. Yeth simply applied the same instinct to numbers instead of voices, and the numbers told an ugly story. 17 shipments over a year, each one slightly overreported on fuel cost. The overage, small enough to escape casual notice, routed through 4 shell accounts before landing somewhere none of the station's standard financial tools could trace. Kell consensus worked by layering small signals until a shape emerged that no single voice had spoken alone. Yeth's cohort mates back on the mining collective would have called what he was doing with the shipping data a private, almost improper kind of consensus. A swarm thought conducted entirely inside one mind instead of shared across many. He didn't care. The numbers formed their pattern the same way a room full of cal formed agreement, quietly, from the edges inward, until the center became obvious to anyone still paying attention. It's not clumsy, Mara said, studying the same data over his shoulder. Clumsy fraud gets caught in a month. This has been running for a year without a single external flag. Whoever built this system knew exactly how deep our audits usually go, and stopped just short of it. They worked through 2 more passes of the data before either of them spoke again, Yeth cross-referencing depot logs while Mara traced the shell accounts backward through 4 layers of shell ownership, each one registered to a different holding company on a different station, all of them ultimately routing back to a single verification key. It was patient, unglamorous work, the kind Yeth had once assumed arbitration mostly wasn't, all shouting matches and dramatic rulings. He was starting to understand that the shouting matches were the easy part. This was the part that actually mattered, the part almost nobody had the patience to do properly, which was exactly why it kept working as a way to hide things. Barrow Ken, Yeth said, the name finally leaving his mouth out loud. Mara didn't confirm it directly, which was, in its own way, a confirmation. We don't accuse anyone until the evidence is airtight. That's not caution for its own sake. It's the only thing that keeps this station neutral. The moment the ledger starts accusing people based on suspicion instead of proof, we are not arbiters anymore. We are just another faction with better paperwork. Is that why nobody knows where you're from? Yeth asked, before he could stop himself. Because if people knew, they'd stop trusting you were neutral. Something shifted in Mara's expression, quick and gone. Not offense. Something closer to recognition, like he'd finally asked a question she'd been waiting for. That's part of it, she said. What's the rest? She was quiet long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer at all. The rest is a longer conversation. Finish the shell account trace first. We'll talk after. They never got to talk after, because that was the day Barrow Ken requested a private meeting, and everything after that moved too fast for conversations that weren't urgent. Yeth wasn't in the room for the meeting. Apprentices rarely were, for anything involving a trade magnate of Barrow Ken's standing. But he was close enough to the arbitration hall's outer corridor to see Mara walk out afterward, and close enough to see that whatever had been said inside had not gone the way Barrow Ken wanted. Dassit, the junior executive from before, caught Yeth's eye in the corridor, and gave him a look he didn't understand until much later, somewhere between pity and warning. She should have taken the settlement, Dassit murmured, almost too quiet to hear, before hurrying after his employer. What settlement? Yeth asked, but Dassit was already gone, and Mara was walking the other way with the particular stillness of someone who had just made an enemy and knew exactly how dangerous he was. Yeth caught up to her near the transit lift, half expecting her to brush the question aside the way she usually did. Instead she stopped, one hand resting on the lift's cold rail, and looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. He offered to make the audit disappear, she said. Quietly. Generously. The kind of offer most stations would have taken without a second thought. You said no. I said no. She started walking again. Which means, from this point forward, he's not going to treat this as a financial problem anymore. He's going to treat it as a threat to be removed. I'd like you to keep your head down for the next few days, Yeth. Not because I think you're in danger. Because I think you're about to start noticing things I'd rather you notice slowly instead of all at once. The settlement, Yeth learned later, had been simple and generous and completely unacceptable. Barrow Ken had offered to quietly repay the skimmed funds, no admission of wrongdoing required, in exchange for the audit being closed without a formal finding. It was the kind of offer that got accepted constantly on Tenway Concord, a face-saving arrangement that let everyone walk away without a public record of fault. Mara had refused it. The fraud pattern implicates more than one shipment, She told the arbitration council the next morning, in the calm, unhurried voice Yeth was starting to recognize, as the sound of someone about to make a very dangerous number of enemies. If we close this quietly, we set a precedent that anyone wealthy enough to offer a settlement can buy their way out of a formal finding. That's not neutral arbitration. That's a toll booth. The council, a mixed panel of station elders from 6 species, exchanged uncomfortable glances. Formal findings against a magnate of Barrow Ken's standing were rare, and rarer still to survive contact with his legal resources without being quietly buried in appeals for years. You understand the resources he'll bring against a formal finding, said the council chair, an aging Fen with cautious eyes. I understand them, Mara said. I'm still recommending it. That afternoon, the small, careful crack in Yetha's understanding of the world widened into something he couldn't ignore anymore. He went back to the archive fragment he'd found days earlier, and this time, instead of searching the public records, he tried the maintenance logs of the archive system itself, looking for whatever had been deleted rather than what remained. Deletion logs were harder to scrub completely. Someone had removed the content of the file, but the log of the removal itself, decades old and forgotten, still existed in a backup nobody had thought to check. Species 0, reference the long quiet, archived per Directive 7, station security. Original entry described extinction event, war, catastrophic weapon escalation among a spacefaring species, self-imposed withdrawal from galactic contact following war's end. Species designation withheld per Directive 7. Cross-reference, neutral arbitration precedent, Concord Charter, Founding Clause 4. Founding Clause 4. Yeth had read the Concord's founding charter as part of his first-year training. He pulled it up now, heart beating in the strange double rhythm Kel felt when consensus and instinct disagreed with each other. Founding Clause 4, this station shall maintain, in perpetuity, a body of neutral arbitration drawn from a source outside all current galactic factions, in recognition of a debt owed following the long quiet, terms of which are recorded under seal and released only upon formal ledger request. A debt. A source outside all current galactic factions. A species deliberately withheld from every public record on the station. He kept digging, though every new search brought back less than the one before it, as if the deeper layers of the archive had been scrubbed more carefully than the surface. He found one more fragment, a partial sensor log dated to a period the station's public history simply skipped over, 3 years compressed into a single administrative note reading sealed record, Directive 7. The sensor log itself was mostly numbers, unreadable without context, except for one line of annotation someone had left decades ago and never bothered to delete. Confirmed, weapon signature inconsistent with any known regional power. Consistent with historical species 0 data. Recommend immediate reclassification of derelict field as sealed heritage site pending ledger review. A derelict field. Somewhere, apparently, close enough to the Concord's own sensor range to have been logged at all, there was physical evidence of whatever the long quiet had actually been, sealed away under a designation, so quiet it had taken Yeth 3 sleepless nights to find even this much. Yeth sat very still in the small apprentice quarters, the pieces arranging themselves into a shape he didn't want to look at directly yet, because looking at it directly meant admitting he already knew what it was. The ledger auditors weren't neutral because they belonged to no faction. They were neutral because they belonged to a species the entire galaxy had quietly agreed, 3 centuries ago, to stop mentioning at all. He didn't sleep much that night. Every small, ordinary thing he'd noticed about Mara over 3 years rearranged itself in his mind into something with a shape he hadn't let himself see before. The way she never spoke of a homeworld. The way her patience never seemed to run out, even on the worst days, as if she'd already survived something that made shipping disputes and dockworker shouting matches look small by comparison. He thought about Founding Clause 4's careful wording, a debt owed following the long quiet, and wondered what a species did, exactly, to earn a debt large enough to require 300 years of silent repayment. Barrow Ken did not appeal quietly. Within 2 days of the formal finding being filed, the station's public channels were flooded with counterclaims, procedural objections, and a public statement accusing the Ledger of bias against Corvain shipping interests specifically. It was a clever move, Yeth realized, watching it unfold. Not a denial of the evidence, which was too solid to deny. An attack on the auditor herself. The individual known as Mara Voss has never submitted verified species documentation to this station, the statement read, in Barrow Ken's own carefully measured voice, broadcast to every public terminal on the Concord. I ask, respectfully, how a body claiming neutrality can render binding judgment against a documented citizen while remaining, itself, entirely undocumented. It should have been a procedural non-issue. Ledger auditors had operated under the unlisted, verified neutral designation for as long as anyone could remember, protected by the same founding charter clause Yeth had found 2 nights earlier. But Barrow Ken wasn't filing a legal challenge. He was filing a public one, and public fear didn't care about legal precedent. By the next morning, the docking bays were full of quiet, uneasy conversation. Old questions that nobody had bothered asking in decades were suddenly everywhere. What species are the Ledger, really? Why has nobody ever seen a Ledger homeworld? What happened to whoever they used to be? Yeth walked through the main concourse on his way to the arbitration hall and felt the difference immediately, a change in the air he couldn't have named but recognized instantly. Merchants who normally nodded to him on sight kept their eyes down. A cluster of dock workers fell silent as he passed, the particular silence of people who had just been talking about something they didn't want overheard. Near the transit lift, he caught 2 Fen engineers arguing in low voices about whether the arbitration hall's rulings from the past year would need to be reopened, an argument that stopped the moment they noticed his apprentice robes. It struck him, walking through all of it, that nobody had accused Mara of anything specific yet. Nobody had proof of wrongdoing, no finding of bias, nothing beyond the bare fact that Barrow Ken had asked a question she couldn't legally answer. And still the fear was already spreading faster than any fact could catch up to it, filling in the silence with whatever shape frightened people needed it to take. Yeth found Mara in the arbitration hall, alone, reviewing the formal finding one last time before it went to the council for ratification. She looked, for the first time since he'd known her, tired. He can't overturn the evidence, Yeth said. So he's trying to overturn you instead. That's usually how it goes, Mara said. When you can't win the argument, you attack whether the other person had the right to make it. Is it true? Yeth asked, and the question came out smaller than he meant it to. What he's implying? That you're not documented because there's something the Ledger doesn't want documented. Mara set down the data slate she'd been holding and looked at him for a long moment, the way she'd looked at contract manifests, careful and unhurried, like she was reading something underneath the surface of what he'd asked. I found the archive fragment too, didn't I? She said. It wasn't quite a question. Yeth's mandibles went still. The long quiet. Species 0. Founding Clause 4. You're a good arbiter, Yeth. You found in 4 days what most people on this station have spent 3 centuries carefully not finding. She exhaled, something in her posture loosening, like a decision she'd been holding for a long time was finally settling into place. I was going to tell you eventually. I didn't expect eventually to arrive quite this fast, or quite this publicly. Why me? Why tell an apprentice at all, when the rest of this station has managed 3 centuries without needing to know? Because you kept asking the question honestly, Mara said. Most people who wonder where we come from stop wondering the moment it becomes inconvenient to keep wondering. You didn't. You went and found the archive fragment on your own, and then you didn't use it against me, and then you kept working the fraud case as carefully as you had before you found it. That's not curiosity, Yeth. That's the beginning of exactly the kind of judgment this work requires. I'd rather you learn the truth from me, on my terms, than piece it together in fragments and decide on your own what it means. Then it is true. Some of it, she said. Most of it, honestly. But the true version and the version Barrow Ken is about to weaponize are not the same story, and the difference between them is about to matter a great deal. Before she could say more, the hall's comm chimed with an urgent priority flag. Council session, called early, mandatory attendance for all active arbitrators. He's not just attacking my credibility, Mara said, reading the summons. He's forcing the identity question into a formal hearing. Public record. Full council. Is that bad? It's what I would have done in his position, she said, and there was something almost like grim respect in her voice. If he can get the council to rule that an unverified species can't hold binding arbitration authority, every finding I've ever made becomes challengeable. Including his. She stood, straightening the plain grey uniform she'd worn every day Yeth had known her, and for the first time, he saw something underneath the calm. Not fear exactly. The particular steadiness of someone walking toward a fight she'd known, somewhere, was always eventually coming. Whatever happens in that hearing, she said, I need you to remember that fear is not the same thing as truth. No matter what the room feels like when it happens. When what happens? When they find out what I am, she said, and walked toward the council chamber without waiting for him to catch up. The council session was still 2 hours off when Yeth found the note waiting on his own terminal, unsigned, routed through 3 relay points, that made tracing it back to a sender all but impossible. Tell your auditor the hearing will go easier if certain testimony stays unspoken. Some debts are better left uncollected. This is a courtesy, not a threat. He read it twice before he understood it was, in fact, exactly a threat, dressed carefully enough to be deniable if anyone official ever asked. His first instinct was to delete it and pretend it had never arrived. His second, slower instinct was to bring it straight to Mara, and he was halfway to the arbitration hall before he'd fully decided which instinct he was going to trust. He found her already reviewing a similar message on her own terminal, her expression unreadable in the way it only became when something genuinely troubled her. You got one too, he said. It wasn't a question. Several, actually. She turned the display so he could see the list, 6 messages routed through the same relay pattern, arriving over the last hour from accounts that had all been created and abandoned within the same narrow window of time. Someone's being thorough. This one came with an image attached. She didn't show him the image, and something in the careful way she didn't made Yeth's stomach turn cold anyway. Is it your family? He asked, before he could stop himself. Is there someone they could actually threaten? No, Mara said, quietly enough that he understood the question had cost her something to answer honestly. That's part of what the ledger asks of us, when we take this work. No family listed on any station record, nothing a hostile party can locate and use as leverage. It isn't kindness. It's a structural precaution, the same way we carry no personal wealth. You can't be threatened effectively through a door that was never built. That sounds lonely. It is, she said, simply, without self-pity. It's also the reason a threat like this has nowhere to land. Whoever sent it is testing whether fear changes my testimony. It won't, and once they understand that, they'll usually escalate to something more direct. I'd rather you knew that going in, so it doesn't surprise you when it happens. It happened less than an hour later, in the transit corridor outside the arbitration hall, when 2 Corvain security contractors in unmarked uniforms fell into step on either side of them, close enough that Yeth felt the sudden, sharp instinct every kill carried from hatching, the swarm deep signal that meant danger, close, coordinated. Auditor Voss, the larger of the two said, not quite blocking the corridor, not quite not blocking it either. My employer would like a private word before the session resumes. Nothing formal. Just a conversation. Your employer had a private word 2 days ago, Mara said, not slowing her pace at all. I gave him an answer then. It hasn't changed. He thought you might reconsider, given what's at stake for you personally today. Everything I have at stake today is already public record, Mara said. That's rather the point of testifying in an open hearing instead of a private conversation in a transit corridor. Tell your employer I said the authors noted, and declined, and that if he sends anyone to intercept me in a corridor again, I'll be including this exchange in my testimony, with your faces on the security footage to go with it. The two contractors exchanged a look, weighing, Yeth guessed, exactly how far their employer wanted this pushed in a corridor with working surveillance cameras. Whatever calculation they ran, it came out in Mara's favor. They stepped aside without another word, and she walked through the gap without breaking stride, as though nothing at all had happened. Yeth caught up to her a full 10 paces later, his heart still hammering with the aftershock of it. You weren't even afraid. I was, Mara said. Being afraid and letting fear choose your next sentence are two different skills. The first one, I don't think anyone gets to switch off completely. The second one is the only part that's actually a choice. She glanced at him, something almost gentle in her expression despite everything. You'll need both of those today too, for what it's worth. Fear's not the problem, Yeth. It's what you let it decide for you. The council chamber was full by the time Yeth arrived, packed tighter than he'd ever seen it, word of the hearing having spread through the Concord faster than any official announcement could travel. 6 species represented on the council dais. A gallery crowded with merchants, dock workers, and off-duty station staff, all of them radiating the particular tension of people who suspected they were about to witness something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. Barrow Ken stood near the front, feathers immaculate, expression carefully arranged into concern rather than triumph, though Yeth could see the triumph underneath it anyway. Yeth found a place near the back of the gallery, close enough to see Mara's face across the chamber, and spent the minutes before the session opened cataloguing the room the way she had taught him to catalogue a dispute, reading the numbers instead of the noise. 6 council members on the dais, each one carefully neutral in posture, none of them looking directly at Mara. A gallery packed 3 species deep, the air thick with the mingled scents and sounds of a crowd that didn't yet know what it was afraid of, only that it was afraid. Somewhere near the front, a young Corvain clutched a data slate like it might protect her from whatever was about to happen. I have no wish to attack the ledger's integrity broadly, Barrow Ken said, once the session opened. I ask only a simple procedural question. Auditor Voss has rendered a binding finding against my organization. Basic arbitration law requires all parties to a binding finding to be documented citizens of a recognized species, precisely so no ruling can be challenged on grounds of unverifiable bias. I ask the Council to confirm Auditor Voss's species documentation, as is my right under station law. The Council Chair turned to Mara with visible reluctance. Auditor Voss. Can you provide species verification? The chamber went very quiet. No, Mara said. I can't, because the ledger's exemption under Founding Clause 4 specifically prohibits it. That exemption was written into this station's charter before any of you were hatched, in recognition of a debt this station owes a species it agreed, at the time, never to name publicly again. Then name it now, Barrow Ken said, smooth and immediate, like he'd been waiting for exactly this opening. If the exemption is legitimate, surely it survives being spoken aloud. Unless the Council believes an unnamed, undocumented species should hold binding authority over documented citizens indefinitely, based on nothing but tradition. It was, Yeth realized watching from the gallery, a perfectly built trap. Say nothing, and look like she was hiding something worth fearing. Say the name, and break a 3-century seal in a room full of people who had spent their whole lives not knowing what they were afraid of. Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked, not at Barrow Ken, but out at the gallery, at the crowded, uneasy faces of dock workers and merchants who had never once, in all their dealings with the ledger, needed to know what species stood behind the grey uniform. Humanity, she said. The word landed in the chamber like something physical. Yeth had heard the word exactly once before, in the archive fragment, stripped of context, meaningless without the history attached to it. He watched it land on the older members of the gallery differently. Watched an elderly Fen near the back go rigid, watched two Corvain elders exchange a look he recognized now as something closer to fear than surprise. Watched the council chair's careful composure crack for exactly 1 second before reassembling. That's not possible, someone said from the gallery, though whether it was denial or hope was impossible to tell. They are gone. The long quiet. Everyone knows the long quiet ended when they. A ripple moved through the older members of the crowd before anyone else spoke, a wordless, physical reaction Yeth had never seen a mixed-species gallery share all at once before. He realized, watching it happen, that the story of the long quiet had survived in different forms depending on who was telling it. Bedtime warnings among the Fen. A cautionary trade guild parable among certain Corvain clans. A half-forgotten footnote in Kel hatchling education, filed alongside other extinct dangers no longer worth fearing. All of them, apparently, pointing at the same 3 centuries of silence, and none of them agreeing on what had actually happened inside it. Destroyed themselves, Mara finished, when the voice trailed off. That's the story that survived. It's not the true one, but it's the one that made everyone comfortable enough to keep trading, keep governing, keep living, without having to think about what actually happened 300 years ago. I'm not going to correct it today, because I think you're ready to hear it. I'm going to correct it because Barrow Ken has left me no other option, and because I would rather you fear the truth for an hour than trust a lie forever. Security, Barrow Ken said quietly, to someone near the chamber doors, and Yeth understood with a cold drop in his chest that this had never been about legal procedure at all. Detain the auditor. A member of a species responsible for the deadliest war this sector has ever recorded has no standing to render judgment over anyone, and this council has just heard her confirm it herself. Station security moved before the council chair could object. Mara didn't resist. She stood perfectly still as 2 officers took position beside her, the same stillness she'd used to end a dock worker riot in under a minute, except this time it did nothing to stop what was happening around her. The gallery had erupted into overlapping arguments, fear and disbelief and old, half-remembered grief tangling together into something loud enough that Yeth could barely hear his own thoughts. Somewhere in the noise, he understood that Barrow Ken had just won, not the legal argument, but the only argument that mattered in a room full of frightened people. He had made them afraid before anyone had the chance to make them understand. Yeth stood in the gallery, mandibles clenched, and for the first time in his life felt the strange, isolating pull of disagreeing with an entire room's consensus at once. He didn't get to speak with Mara that night, held as she was in a security holding suite meant more for procedural show than actual containment, but he spent the hours until the reconvened hearing doing the only useful thing he could think to do. He went back to the sealed sensor log, the one referencing a derelict field somewhere in range of the Concord's old scanners, and this time, instead of searching for the record itself, he searched for what the station had done about it. The answer, buried under 3 layers of administrative redirection, was almost anticlimactic. The field had been quietly designated a heritage site decades ago, its coordinates removed from public navigation charts, its contents never salvaged, never disturbed, protected under the same founding clause that protected the ledger's silence. Not a fleet. Not a weapon cache. A graveyard, Yeth realized, reading the sparse technical notes twice to be sure he understood them correctly. Wreckage from the final engagements of the long quiet, left exactly where it had fallen, because someone, generations ago, had decided that some things earned by war deserved to stay buried rather than studded. It wasn't proof of anything Barrow Ken could use against her. If anything, it was the opposite. A species capable of ending a war that catastrophic had also been careful enough, methodical enough, to make sure the physical evidence of it stayed sealed rather than paraded as either trophy or threat. Yeth brought the finding to the reconvened hearing not as a weapon, but because he thought, given everything else happening that day, the room deserved to know that the debt being discussed wasn't an abstraction. It had a location. It had a weight. And for 300 years, it had been treated with more care than most of the station's own history. They held the reconvened hearing 2 days later, once station security had confirmed there was, in fact, no legal basis to hold a ledger auditor without formal charges, and once the initial panic had cooled enough for the council to remember they were supposed to be arbiters, not a mob. Mara stood before the full council again, calmer than Yeth thought he could have managed in her position. The gallery was even more crowded than before, word having spread across the entire Concord and several neighboring systems by now. Somewhere out past the station's hull, Yeth had heard, 3 separate trade fleets had paused their approach vectors, waiting to see how this played out before deciding whether Tenway Concord was still safe to dock at. "I want to be precise about what happened 300 years ago," Mara said, once the chair granted her the floor, "because precision is the entire foundation of what my order does, and I owe this room precision more than I owe it comfort. Humanity fought a war against itself before it fought anyone else. Internal factions, escalating weapons, each side certain the other had to be stopped by any means necessary. By the time it spread beyond our own systems and drew in outside powers, the weapons being developed were no longer capable of distinguishing between winning and destroying everything worth winning. My ancestors reached a point where every available path forward ended in extinction, ours or someone else's. So they chose a different path. Not surrender. Withdrawal. A complete, deliberate dismantling of every structure that had let the war escalate that far, including our own visible presence in galactic affairs." Mara paused, and for the first time since Yeth had known her, let something personal slip into her voice, quiet and unhurried, the way she read a difficult manifest. "I won't pretend it was a clean choice. Withdrawal cost us almost everything a species can lose without losing itself entirely. We gave up our fleets. We gave up our worlds, most of them, scattered and resettled under names that erased what they'd been. We gave up the right to ever again be the loudest voice in a room, because the loudest voice was exactly what had nearly ended us. What we kept was smaller, and harder to see, and I think that's why it's taken 3 centuries for anyone to notice it was still here at all. We kept the discipline. We kept the refusal to let power decide what was true. Those 2 things, it turns out, are enough to rebuild trust with, even if they are not enough to rebuild an empire with. We were never trying to rebuild an empire. You could have simply left," Barrow Ken said. "Gone dark, vanished, spared everyone the discomfort of ever encountering you again." "We considered it," Mara said. "But leaving doesn't repay a debt. Every species drawn into that war lost something because of choices humanity made. Founding Clause 4 exists because this station's charter was written, in part, by the last human command authority who negotiated our withdrawal. The condition attached to our silence was simple. We would spend however long it took proving, through action rather than declaration, that a species capable of what we were capable of could also be trusted never to do it again. Neutral arbitration was the method we chose. Not because it was safe. Because it was the opposite of safe. It puts unlimited trust in our hands and gives us no weapon, but the truth, forever, in front of everyone." The chamber was silent in a different way now, Yeth thought, than it had been 2 days earlier. Not the silence of fear looking for a target. Something closer to a room recalculating, carefully, everything it thought it understood. Yeth, still holding the floor from the council's earlier gesture the day before, added the piece he'd found that night, quieter than his earlier testimony, but no less deliberate. "There's a sealed heritage site on this station's old charts, past the edge of our current sensor range. Wreckage from the long quiet, left exactly where it fell 3 centuries ago. Nobody salvaged it. Nobody studied it. Nobody even mentioned it, until I went looking specifically for what had happened to it. A species that fought a war that catastrophic could have brought that wreckage home as a warning, or a trophy, or a weapon to reverse engineer. Instead they sealed it and left it alone for 300 years, the same way they've sealed and left alone almost everything else about themselves. I don't think that's the behavior of a threat this council needs to fear. I think it's the behavior of someone still, quietly, trying not to be one. 300 years, the council chair said slowly, and not one recorded incident of ledger bias. Not one finding overturned for corruption. Not one credit unaccounted for. That's not an accident, Mara said. That's the entire point. One of the other council members, a Corvain elder who had said little through the entire proceeding, leaned forward. You ask us to believe a species capable of the long quiet has spent 3 centuries quietly settling shipping disputes for no reward beyond a stipend it gives away. Forgive me, auditor. That is a difficult symmetry to accept. It should be difficult, Mara said. If it were easy to accept, it would be easy to fake, and then this whole arrangement would be worth nothing. You don't have to take my word for the symmetry. You have 300 years of rulings to check it against. Every one of them is on record. I'd rather you audit us the way I audited Barrow Ken's shipping accounts than believe anything I say today without evidence behind it. Barrow Ken, sensing the room shifting away from him, made his final move. Regardless of history, the finding against my organization stands built on the judgment of an undocumented individual whose true nature was concealed from this council until forced into the open. I ask again, formally, that the finding be vacated on those grounds. It was, Yeth realized, technically still a fair procedural argument. And it might have worked, if the council had needed to decide alone. I'd like to speak, Yeth said, before he'd fully decided to say it, his voice cutting through the chamber louder than he intended. Every head turned toward him, apprentice robes marking him as far too junior to be addressing a full council session, and he felt every eye in the room land on him at once. The council chair, visibly startled, gestured him forward anyway. Public hearings allowed any station resident to submit testimony, a rule so rarely invoked Yeth suspected half the chamber had forgotten it existed. I found the fraud pattern in Barrow Ken's shipping accounts myself, Yeth said, forcing his voice steady. I compiled the raw data. Auditor Voss's finding wasn't built on hidden bias. It was built on evidence I helped verify, evidence that exists independent of whatever species she is. If you vacate the finding, you're not correcting a procedural flaw. You're telling every future magnate on this station that if the evidence against you is strong enough, all you have to do is make the arbiter's identity the story instead. He looked at Barrow Ken, feathers immaculate, expression carefully neutral, and felt something steady settle into place inside his own chest. I've watched Auditor Voss work for 3 years, Yeth said. I've never once seen her rule in favor of anyone based on species, wealth, or fear. That includes today, standing in front of a room that is currently very afraid of her. If that's not what neutral looks like, I don't know what the word means anymore. One of the council members, a younger Fen, who had said nothing through the entire proceeding, cleared his throat. I want to say plainly what I suspect several of us are thinking and few of us want to admit aloud. I am afraid of what Auditor Voss's species did 300 years ago. That fear did not vanish the moment she explained it well. But I notice that my fear, right now, is aimed at a story from 3 centuries past, and not at anything she has done in the 11 years I have sat on this council watching her work. I would like the record to reflect that those are different things, and that this council owes it to itself to rule on the second, not the first. A murmur of agreement moved through the dais, quiet but unmistakable. Barrow Ken's feathers had gone very still, the stillness Yeth now recognized as a Corvain tell for a losing position. The council chair turned back to Mara one final time. If we uphold the finding today, and uphold Founding Clause 4 alongside it, this station will be publicly acknowledging that it knowingly harbors a member of a species most of the galaxy still believes extinct, and has for some time. That is not a small thing to put into permanent record. I want to be certain you understand what you're asking this council to stand behind. I understand it better than anyone in this room, Mara said. I've spent longer thinking about what that record would cost than any of you have had the chance to. I'm asking you to stand behind it anyway, because the alternative is a station that only trusts its own arbitration when the arbiter's identity is comfortable enough not to ask about. That's not neutrality. That's just prejudice with better manners. The chamber was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, the council chair looked around at the other 5 members of the dais, and something unspoken passed between them, the particular silence of a decision arriving without needing to be argued any further. The finding stands, the chair said. Founding Clause 4 remains in effect, unmodified, effective immediately. This council formally acknowledges the ledger's continued neutral standing, and thanks Auditor Voss for a debt 300 years overdue in its recognition. Barrow Ken said nothing. There was nothing left to say. He turned and left the chamber without waiting to be dismissed, and Yeth understood that whatever else happened to his shipping empire in the coming months, it would happen without the shield of anonymity he'd tried to force onto someone else. The Concord did not become comfortable with the truth overnight. Yeth understood that much within a day of the hearing's end. Old fears, once spoken aloud, didn't simply evaporate because a council had ruled correctly. 4 weeks afterward, he noticed the small, careful distance some station residents kept from any ledger uniform, awareness that hadn't existed before Barrow Ken forced the word out into the open. But something else had changed too, quieter and slower, and harder to notice unless you were looking for it the way Yeth had learned to look for patterns underneath surface noise. Trade disputes that used to take days to schedule and audit for started arriving faster, people specifically requesting ledger arbitration instead of trying to settle things through faction pressure first. A Fen elder who'd gone rigid with fear during the first hearing stopped Mara in a corridor 2 weeks later, not to apologize, exactly, but to ask a quiet, careful question about her order's history that Yeth suspected had taken considerable courage to ask at all. Yeth's own standing among the other apprentices shifted too, in ways he hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure how to feel about. Some treated him with a new, careful respect, the apprentice who had stood up in a full council session and been listened to. Others kept a small distance from him, the same distance he'd noticed people keeping from Mara, as if standing beside her in that hearing had made him slightly less knowable too. He found, to his own surprise, that he minded the distance less than he'd expected. It was easier to sit with than the alternative would have been, the quiet shame of having said nothing at all. Barrow Ken's shipping consortium did not collapse, though it lost enough contracts over the following months that Yeth suspected it eventually would, slowly, the way reputations usually failed on a station that ran on trust more than law. Dassit, the junior executive, resigned his position within a season and filed, of all things, an application to the arbitration apprenticeship program himself, piece of news that made Mara laugh for the first time Yeth had ever heard. You said something in the hearing, Yeth said to Mara, one evening in the arbitration hall, long after the day's cases had ended. About proving trust through action instead of declaration. Is that why the ledger never explains itself? Never defends itself until it's forced to? Partly, Mara said. The rest is simpler. Explaining yourself asks people to trust your words. 300 years of neutral rulings asks them to trust your record instead. Words are easy to fake. A record like that isn't. Barrow Ken almost broke it anyway. One accusation, one hearing, and half the station was ready to believe the worst about you before you'd said a single word in your own defense. He didn't almost break the record, Mara said. The record held. What he almost broke was people's willingness to look at it clearly. Those aren't the same thing, even if they feel like it from the inside. Yeth thought about that for a while, turning it over the way he turned over patterns in shipping manifests, looking for the shape underneath. There are others like you, he said finally. Other ledger auditors. Other stations. More than you'd guess. Fewer than you'd think, given how long we've had to rebuild. What happens to me now? Yeth asked. I'm the apprentice who stood up in a public hearing and vouched for a species half this station is still afraid of. That's not exactly a quiet start to a career in neutral arbitration. No, Mara agreed. It's a loud one. I won't pretend that doesn't come with a cost. Some council members will remember it as courage. Others will remember it as recklessness, and a few will quietly decide you can't be trusted to stay neutral yourself, since you've already shown you're willing to take a side when it matters. She considered him for a moment, the same careful, unhurried attention she gave a disputed manifest. For what it's worth, I think you did the only thing an actual arbiter can do in that position. You didn't defend me because of who I turned out to be. You defended the process, because the evidence was sound regardless of my species. That's a harder thing to teach than most of what's in your training manuals, and you already knew it before I did. Will you ever stop hiding what you are? Now that it's public here, at least. Mara considered the question longer than he expected. I don't think of it as hiding, exactly. I think of it as choosing when the truth is useful instead of just loud. It was useful today, because it forced this council to rule on evidence instead of fear, in public, permanently. That's worth more than 3 centuries of quiet reputation could have bought on its own. She paused. But no, I don't think we'll go back to complete anonymity. Not here. Not after this. Some debts, once you've started repaying them out loud, are better finished the same way. Outside the arbitration hall's viewport, Tenway Concord turned slowly against the backdrop of the drift, its trade lanes as busy as they'd been the morning Yeth had first watched Mara settle a dockworkers' dispute in under a minute. New transport manifests were arriving on the morning schedule, as they always did. Somewhere among them, Yeth knew now, would be another auditor listed simply as unlisted, verified neutral, continuing the same slow, patient work that had been quietly holding this station's fairness together for longer than anyone currently living on it had known to be grateful for. He didn't know that species yet, not really, not beyond one careful woman who read numbers instead of fear and never once, in 3 years of watching her, had asked for anything back. He thought he might, someday, if the ledger accepted him the way Sit was hoping to be accepted, come to know it a great deal better than most people currently living on the Concord ever would. The thought didn't frighten him the way it might have a season ago. It felt, instead, like the start of a much longer audit, one he suspected would take a great deal more than 9 days to complete, and one he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he wanted to see through to the end. But he thought, watching the new manifests scroll past, that maybe understanding didn't need to arrive all at once. Maybe it was enough, for now, that a debt 3 centuries old had finally been spoken aloud in a crowded room, and the room, eventually, had chosen to believe it. Somewhere past the edge of the drift, on a station none of them had ever heard of, another grey-uniformed figure was walking into another crowded hearing room, carrying nothing but a data slate and 300 years of quiet, unbroken proof. They still had a great deal left to repay. But for the first time in a long while, they were no longer repaying it alone in the dark.